Allied commanders questioned Lawrence about what he had told the Arabs. Faisal walked out. The two men who had fought together so hard for this day now went their separate ways. Lawrence makes no mention of this in Seven Pillars. He says only that he was exhausted.
I made to Allenby the only request I ever asked him for myself: leave to go. In the end, he agreed, and then at once, I knew how much I was sorry.
By the time the days in Damascus are winding down, he's a mess. I mean, he just wants to get out. But he's already got in mind he's got to go fight. The real battle is now going to be at the peace conference. It's not going to be in the Middle East anymore. He knows that. So even though he's seemingly living out what looks like his own personal desperation and exhaustion, he's already planning for the next move.
Lawrence wrote a farewell letter to Cairo headquarters.
I'm off out of Egypt. This old war is closing and my use is gone. My regards to the staff. We were an odd little set, and we have, I expect, changed history in the Near East. I wonder how the powers will let the Arabs get on.
For Lawrence, there was a bitter grief to come. He received news that Dahum, his Carchemish friend, had died of typhoid, just too soon to hear of the victory Lawrence had won for him.
Death seemed my servant on the road, till we were near and saw you waiting. When you smiled, and in sorrowful envy he outran me and took you apart into his quietness.
As Lawrence arrived home, Britain was celebrating the end of the war. In government, working committees were already discussing how to reshape the map in the aftermath of the conflict. Lawrence was called to brief the War Cabinet's Eastern Committee, who would help decide the future of Arabia.
Gentlemen, Colonel Lawrence.
He presented his plan for the region, complete with a new map, the names of those he thought should rule, and a definition of the British Empire as a partnership of nations. But he was far from certain that they would take his advice. So Lawrence launched a high-profile lobbying campaign to draw attention to the Arab cause.
Lawrence felt absolutely furious because he had persuaded men to risk everything, to risk their lives. He felt that all the promises he'd made had been made in good faith, and that the Arabs essentially, and particularly Faisal, had been deceived. I think Lawrence felt really pissed off.
Lawrence's letters were published in the Times.
Sir, your correspondent wishes to draw the reader's attention to the extraordinary courage of the Arab nations' support of the British war. Pledges were made in His Majesty's name, which our nation is beholden to meet.
The letters created tremendous waves in government circles. But it was not enough. Lawrence realized the tide was turning against him, that elements in the government were blocking moves for Arab independence. He would have to make his arguments heard another way. Lawrence traveled to Buckingham Palace to join other heroes receiving their medals from King George. For his achievements in the Desert War, he was to be presented with the Distinguished Service Order and the Companionship of the Bath, two of the highest awards a Briton could receive. But when his moment came, Lawrence refused the honors.
Why he rejected his medals from the king is very simple. The only way he could show his dissatisfaction for what had transpired was to say to the king, no thank you. I don't mean to offend you, Your Majesty, but I really feel I can't take these awards from the state. I mean, a tremendous break with decorum.
English society was appalled. It was an unprecedented snub for the king. Lawrence had made his voice heard. But the same newspapers that reported his royal insult began to edit his letters. The Times cut the most controversial sections, and its editor wrote a column supporting the status quo. The establishment was closing ranks. Lawrence did persuade the British to invite Faisal to London. Perhaps with the man on the ground, people would talk. Lawrence brokered a meeting that might seem extraordinary today. He introduced Faisal to Haim Weizmann, leader of the Zionists. They had dinner in the Piccadilly home of Lord Rothschild to discuss how the Jews and the Arabs might become allies, to secure what both parties wanted from the post-war settlement. As Faisal put it, we are the two main branches of the same Semitic family. But the British government showed little interest. Officials were more concerned about their own claims than those of the Arabs. Lawrence realized he would have to take the Arab cause to the international arena. Everything, he wrote, depends on the conference. The peace conference of the War to End All Wars had begun in Paris. The French themselves would be the key obstacle to Arab aims. They wanted Syria for themselves. They even tried to stop Faisal from reaching Paris and questioned his right to attend the conference. With Lawrence's help, he argued his way into the proceedings. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with his famous 14 points, the principles that he argued should allow peoples to govern themselves. Point number 12 specifically called for the Arabs to be given the opportunity of autonomous development. Lawrence and Faisal would use this to argue their case. But first, they would have to persuade the conference organizers to give them a hearing.
The Middle East wasn't the most important subject that was being discussed. Remember, Europe has just had this terrible bloodletting in the Somme and elsewhere, and they had to have a reconstruction. That was the real issue. But Lawrence stole the limelight. He was, as usual, making the most of the situation, and he was playing with important people, and he tried to get Faisal's issues pushed up the agenda, and he succeeded.
Lawrence and Faisal presented the Arab case to the Council of World Leaders. They could do no more. The Council would now meet and deliberate, and the Arabs must wait for the outcome. Lawrence was acutely aware that this was history in the making. In Paris, he began to write 7 Pillars of Wisdom.
The dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act out their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. This I did. I meant to make a new nation.
The peace conference had reached its conclusion. The delegates signed the Treaty of Versailles. For the Arabs, President Wilson's 14 points would seem a distant memory.
Well, it was 14 points, literally, for everybody else except for the Arabs.
The victors had drawn new maps for the post-war world. The Arabs were pushed south out of Syria, where the French won their claim, west out of Mesopotamia, where the British took power, and out of Palestine and Jerusalem, where the Zionists would have a homeland under a British mandate.
The borders were not designed to meet with Arab interests or with Arab hopes and aspirations. They were a reflection of imperial designs between the British and the French on the one hand, and also the Zionists on the other hand.
The big issue was Palestine. When the British had made their pre-war promises to the Arabs, Palestine had been included in territory that was to come under Arab rule. The Arab leader, Sharif Hussein, refused to accept any settlement that did not include all Arab territory.
But the Arabs believed and still believe that Great Britain honestly promised that it will recognize a united and independent Arab state in the East.
That breach of promise, I think, to a large degree, until the moment that we are living, and perhaps well into maybe the next 100 years or more, will determine the affairs of the Arab world and Europe and the Middle East.
The Arabs decided to defy the superpowers and take the initiative and ignore the Versailles Treaty. They declared self-government. For the first time in 5 centuries, the Arabs were free of foreign rule. Emir Faisal was crowned king. The Arab dream became reality.
They thought that they will have prosperity, they will have democracy, they will have new schools, new roads, new hospitals. The West will treat them differently. So this was the point at which the Arabs thought they had finally begun to build a new future for themselves and become masters of their own house.
5 months later, the dream was over. The French army arrived in Syria to enforce the treaty. The French threatened airstrikes if the Arabs resisted. King Faisal was ordered to leave. He was left to wait for a train like any other passenger. As he traveled through Transjordan, Faisal was met by a company of British soldiers. He didn't know if they were there to arrest him or to honor him. He was invited to inspect them, a last gesture on his way into exile. Lawrence had rushed home from Paris on news that his father was gravely ill. He was too late. He was left to mourn for his father and for the Arabs.
We lived many lives in those swirling campaigns, never sparing ourselves. Then the new world dawned. The old men came out again and took our victory to remake in the likeness of the former world they knew. Youth would win, but had not learned to keep. And it was pitiably weak against age. We stammered that we worked for a new haven and a new earth. And they thanked us kindly and made their peace.
Faisal believed that Lawrence was a good friend to the Arabs. But he knew Faisal was a statesman. He knew that Lawrence was an employee by his government. So he shouldn't be blamed because he is not the government.
I think that he thought that the Arabs had been sold down the river. I think he realised that he's played his part in that, and that generally he was so concerned by what had happened that he just wanted to run away from it.
Ironically, at his moment of defeat, at his personal lowest ebb, Britain and the world were about to celebrate Lawrence as a star. Lowell Thomas, the American who had tracked Lawrence in the desert, brought his film lecture about the Desert War to London. It would turn Lawrence into a prototype matinee idol. He was flattered and appalled by his celebrity.
To have news value is to have a tin can tied to one's tail.
A friend wrote that he liked to be recognized, but not to let people see. He had a genius for backing into the limelight. He had become the hero he always dreamed of being.
I think there are lots of people in life who may have aspired to become the hero, to become the star, whatever it might be, and who, once they've got there, have found it was hollow. And I think in Lawrence's case, all the more so, because it wasn't just a case of him becoming the hero, it was a case of him becoming the hero at great cost to other people, which he realized.
He wrote that he had thrown away his medals for someone to find one day and to wonder at their history. Lawrence had retreated to Oxford and the safety of the academic world when he was contacted by Winston Churchill. Churchill had been appointed colonial secretary and told to sort out the chaos in the East. He offered Lawrence a job as his advisor. It would be Lawrence's last effort in Arabia, his last chance at redemption. Churchill, Lawrence, and other Middle East experts traveled to Cairo for another conference. On the map, but this time Lawrence would have a direct say in where the borders were drawn and a chance to make good on his promises. In Transjordan, Emir Abdullah took the throne. In the new nation of Iraq, Faisal would be king.
When Faisal was established in Iraq and Abdullah in Jordan, the nation saw in Britain a spark of conscience. Even though things were not as they had hoped for, it was something.
Lawrence was pleased with what he had achieved for the Arabs. He wrote that Britain had quit Arabia having kept her promises.
I don't think that was a true statement or an honest statement on the part of Lawrence, to put it mildly.
I think he says that because he's trying to feel okay about something which is not okay. I think that's false. I think he's, like many of us, I think we want to believe certain things are true when they're not. I mean, we'll often say, well, I did okay. I acquitted myself all right here. We kind of know we didn't.
The Arabs saw the Cairo settlement as window dressing. They felt they had fought a war for nothing. Now they rebelled. The British and French responded with airstrikes and gas attacks. Tens of thousands of Arabs died. Baghdad and Damascus lay in ruins.
I think what strikes you when you look back at this, you think nothing changes. All the issues are the same issues. You know, you've got Zionism, Arab nationalism, tribesmen who are fanatical, the concerns about how you're going to suppress that fanaticism. It's all the same issues.
Lawrence was near to a breakdown.
I am so tired. I want to lie down and sleep and not wake up.
For 8 years, he'd been through this horror of constant tension, constant violence. He was near to an emotional breakdown. And the toll of being so involved in close-up events of violence for which he took exaggerated responsibility eventually did drive him out of a prominent role in public life.
Name? Ross John Hume, 352087, sir.
Lawrence would spend his middle age in hiding, trying to escape his celebrity and responsibility by joining the ranks of the Royal Air Force.
What are these? Superficial wounds, sir. Answer my question. A barbed wire tear, sir, over the fence. God. And these? Punishment? Persuasion, sir.
The hero of Damascus, the uncrowned king of Arabia, would spend his middle age.
If ever there was a man squeezed right out dry by over-experience, then it's me. I don't think I'll be fit for anything ever again.
He wrote to friends that although he struggled with the drudgery of barrack life, he wouldn't leave the RAF for any job he was offered. But the calm wouldn't last. Within months of his enlistment, the press found him. He was dismissed from the RAF because his presence there might cause the service an embarrassment. "Damn the press," he wrote. He changed his name again and spent the next decade moving from Air Force to Army and back again, from posting to posting, trying to find somewhere he could be anonymous. He rented a small cottage in Dorset, Clouds Hill, which he used as a hideaway when on leave. The Greek inscription above the door reads, "Does not care." But his letters were full of doubts about the justness of the Middle East settlement.
Surely my share in helping to settle the Middle East atones me for my misdeeds in the war. I think so anyway. If Iraq continues to put up a decent show over 3 generations, then the revolt was worthwhile.
But Faisal's line did not last. He ruled for just 10 years, then died of heart disease in a Swiss clinic. His son reigned until 1958, when he and his entire family were executed in a revolution. "30 years after Lawrence's death, a man came forward with an account of how Lawrence paid him for beatings. It has been largely accepted by those who have studied the evidence. Some suggest that Lawrence was seeking to punish himself, others that it was for sexual gratification.
We have to be compassionate about Lawrence. He had certainly seen a great deal of death and had killed people and watched people being killed, and that must have had quite an effect on him, taken quite a toll. And you combine that perhaps with repressed homosexuality, who knows, and you get some very strange reactions.
In 1935, aged 46, Lawrence left the RAF and his service life for the last time. He planned a quiet retirement at Clouds Hill. But with Britain and Europe again facing the prospect of war, the hero of Arabia was in demand. Churchill wanted him to command the nation's home defense. The British fascists wanted him to join their leadership. Others wanted him to act as ambassador for peace. Lawrence, T.E. Shaw, as he now called himself, would not be prized from his cottage. He sent cards announcing his retreat from the world.
Wild mares would not drag me from here now.
Lawrence's purest escape was speed. He was thrilled at driving his powerful bikes as hard as they would go.
Lawrence liked speed because it stopped him thinking. He found a freedom from the world of the intellect and a descent into the world of feeling and freedom with it. He loved speed. He was a speed freak.
On May the 13th, 1935, Lawrence rode to the post office to send a telegram. He was on his way home when he lost control of the bike, swerved to avoid two cyclists, and crashed. He never regained consciousness. Lawrence died 6 days later. The press reported his death like today they might cover the death of a superstar. There were reports of plots and assassination. Lawrence was simply too great a character for people to accept he could die in an ordinary accident. From the Arabs who knew him, there was grief too. Men from tribes and towns where Lawrence had lived and fought sent their respects. Tell them in England his heart was steel, of manhood the man, in freedom free, a mind without an equal. There were representatives from King George, ambassadors, generals and statesmen, Churchill among them. Lawrence, Churchill said, was one of those beings whose pace of life was faster and more intense than what is normal. So he flew best in the hurricane. In the heroic period, he found himself in perfect relation both to men and events. He will live in history.
We've mischief and mayhem brought to us by the master of trickery, Orson Welles, next, as we look at the media chaos and widespread panic caused by his infamous radio broadcast, The War of the Worlds, next.
PBS presents